Hello and welcome to Eastern Roman History. Today I'm joined by Vince and Casey, who run the podcast Autocrat, where they explore Roman civilization. Would you like to explain more about it and introduce yourselves?
Hello, it's lovely to be here. So, as you said, I'm Vince,
I'm Cassie.
and we explore Roman civilization, like you said, starting with the Greek myths, because the Romans would have considered themselves very based in Greek mythology, using Aeneas as an example there, and hopefully going all the way through to 1453 and beyond, which does include a large number of people considered Byzantine emperors, which is why we're here today.
Indeed. So this is the first of two discussions about some of the most notable and infamous Roman emperors from late antiquity and the Middle Ages. This will be released on my channel, and then the second part, which there will be links to in the description below, will be released on their channel. Today we'll be talking about 10 emperors that had a major impact on the Eastern Roman Empire. So I have chosen 5, and my guests have chosen 5 of their own, and here we'll talk about them. So I have chosen 5 from the list I made in a video last year about my best to worst emperors, and I have chosen Theodosius II, Constance II, Leo III, Romanos I, and Manuel I. Which emperors have you chosen?
We've chosen Justinian I, Heraclius, Maurice, Alexios I, and Basil II.
Splendid. Well, as my guests, would you like to fire the first shot and talk about your first emperor?
By all means. So I guess I should start us off with the person probably considered the heavyweight of the group, and that's Justinian I. So Roman emperor from 527 to 565, and probably most famous for his attempted reconquest of the Western Roman Empire, and I would say fairly successful in that regard, getting as far as North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, but eventually being brought down somewhat by the first arrival of the Black Death on the scene in the 540s. And I think all round a very interesting individual to discuss.
Definitely. I went to a bookshop recently, and Peter Saris, who is a scholar of Justinian and his era, recently released a biography. And I was reading the introduction to it, and he was making the comparison between Justinian and his response to the plague and our response to a similar plague in recent years. So it just goes to show how relevant the study of Justinian can be and filter through the ages. So what
Absolutely.
did you find about his life and reign which you thought was notable, and why is he in your 5 emperors?
I think Justinian is one of the few emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire who's actually managed to stay relevant in the modern day. That when I was a child, I had a book on the Romans published by Usborne, and one of the only Eastern Roman emperors to actually get mentioned at all was Justinian himself and his reconquest, before sort of glossing over everything from then until 1453 in maybe 1 or 2 sentences. So he's managed to stay in the public consciousness a little bit, and I would say partially this might be due to the fact that he is seen as this hope of Rome being revived, personified in a way. Not many other emperors have managed to do this, so there are later ones such as Alexios or the Komnenoi generally, and Basil II, who do try and reconquer some land, but this dream of the Roman Empire of antiquity is not really there anymore. And I think some people have called him pretty much the last Roman. I mean, he was the last emperor who spoke Latin. I think some people actually think that either his reconquests or the loss of territory to Islam in the early 600s represent the end of the Roman Empire in its classical form. So he's just a really interesting individual to consider at a sort of crossroads of history.
Not only the scope of the conquests he achieved, but also the scope of his impact on internal and domestic affairs as well, which
Yeah.
it was a huge impact on. So, what struck you as being something that he was particularly notable for?
I would say in internal affairs, what Justinian would be most known for is the Justinianic Code, or I think it's called the Corpus Juris Civilis, which is an attempt to streamline all of Roman law into one body of work. I would say that's what he's most known for in that particular regard. And I don't know if you have a bit more insight into this, but as far as I know, Roman law from Theodosius II onwards had just become this mess of contradictions, if I understand correctly, which Justinian wanted to cut through and streamline once again.
Yes, in a way, it's because Theodosius II, his compilation of law was from the time of Diocletian and Constantine, in terms of compiling all the laws from that era, whereas Justinian goes even further back to Augustus. So it's much wider scope, and also the breadth of reform is so much larger, whereas Theodosius is only looking at actual laws that are being made and codifying them. Justinian is going right through the whole process of, because you have the digest and the institutes as well, which deal with jurisprudence and how to become a lawyer, a judge, and so forth. So it's the whole package of Roman law and the justice system. And in fact, if you've ever seen a printed copy of the Corpus Juris Civilis, it's enormous. This is like an A3 sheet of paper, 2 bricks stacked together in terms of thickness. And then the Theodosian Code is like a third of the size. So there's that. And also, something striking about his reign is that there's a lot of internal changes that go on, some of which were heavily criticized by his critics. But also, there's a lot happening in his reign beyond just the two most notable things of law and conquest. There's also reorganization of how governorships work, where commands are being combined into one again. So like there's only one commander of Africa rather than 2. The Balkan frontier is reorganized. Provisioning the army on the eastern frontier is reorganized. So and also the postal system has changed a bit. So it's quite a huge impact. I mean, we can't dwell on it too much here because there's too much to go through. And
absolutely.
I think perhaps an interesting thing to think about is popularly, it attracts a lot of attention from what ifs and counterfactuals. And I do think that, so what would you think? And they do draw quite a lot of criticism in a way, perhaps a bit unfairly, towards his reign. So what do you think of that? Do you think people overthink his reign, or are some of these counterfactuals justified at all?
Well, there is, if I understand correctly, there is a school of thought very similar to this, which I read in the introduction of William Rosen's book Justinian's Flea. And in it, he essentially argues that at the very zenith of Justinian's power, the Black Death showed up, and that without this, the Roman Empire might not have collapsed as readily as it did, or I suppose all changed into the Byzantine, if you will, form from later years. And he makes an example of the contrast between China and Rome in this regard, both multi-century empires which underwent shrinking or collapse around about the 300s and had started to reconquer everything in the 500s. But whereas China would stay unified until the 10th century, Rome did not, and Europe became a body of many different identities and ethnicities, which I believe, if I understand it correctly, he says the Black Death was one of the reasons for. But in that regard, my point is, there is a lot of emphasis, even in scholarly works, on the potential counterfactuals of Justinian's reign. Maybe because he is seen as this great figure who could have done so much more if given the resources.
From what you've been reading about Justinian, how would you assess him as an emperor?
I would say that Justinian is someone who certainly achieved very noteworthy things, but unfortunately, with the benefit of hindsight, a lot of that progress was undone by subsequent events he couldn't have known about, such as the rise of Islam, which would ultimately sweep away all of the North African and Levantine possessions of the empire. And there are controversial viewpoints and stories associated with him, such as in his secret histories, Procopius, I think, calls him a headless demon several times and portrays him and his wife Theodora as very grasping to the detriment of the empire. So he's a complex individual who had a big dream and a big vision and seemed to be possessed by that, but ultimately didn't achieve as much as he would perhaps have hoped to, while still being very popular and great in the common imagination.
I do think that Justinian, I agree with you that he was a great emperor. It's not just the one dimension of Justinian as a great conqueror. This multifacet of him being such an active emperor in every field of governance, as a administrator, as a military organizer, pushing the geopolitical stage, and also as a diplomat and looking at the economy. And also you've got sponsoring of public works and stuff like that. So he's active in every sphere. We mentioned the 7th century, so moving on to my first emperor is Constance II, which may surprise quite a few people for him being here. But he is a very important emperor for many reasons. It's quite a strange set of circumstances that you have this 10-year-old boy who becomes emperor. Although he's not the greatest warrior or necessarily the greatest statesman, he does help the empire survive during the 27 years of his reign. The line is being steadied slowly, and it goes in and out of phases of aggression. So right at the end of his reign, you've got this huge invasion, which is heading towards Constantinople, which just about deals with, but he's assassinated by that point. So he's not the greatest military emperor, but he is trying. Some of his ideas, although fail, like his invasion of Egypt in the 640s, but had it succeeded, it could have been an incredibly important reverse for the Romans. Being able to recapture their breadbasket, easily one of their most important provinces, Egypt. And also, he's one of the only emperors who bothers to concentrate on the West and actually goes to the West in his later reign. So he goes to Greece and then he goes to Rome and eventually settles in Syracuse in Sicily, which is not something that any emperor does after him. And it is quite a strange move, but it does show that he's thinking a bit more strategically about what's happening. And also, one of the things he's doing while he's in the West is reorganizing the provinces, which comes to my next point about how he's quite important for changing how the state runs in this much smaller, compact state that it's in. So he introduces the half tax, which is to do with taxing people's households rather than the late Roman system of there's the organization of the professional Roman navy in this period, the Carabisianoi, and his move west is partly to do with that he organizes all of these regions in the west to start pulling their resources together to help make this fleet, which is able to help defend the east. He's also one of the last emperors to mint large numbers of coins, which are circulating in the empire for quite a long time. After his reign, the amount of coinage that is being found in archaeology dips dramatically in quite a large part of the empire, and it only really creeps back up again in the reign of Leo VI. So it's quite a watershed moment in that regard, where the use of money is reduced, and it reflects the times in a way that we have this last blast of a heavily monetized economy. It never completely shrinks, but it never but it's heavily reduced. So it's quite a watershed moment in that regard. And also you have all the religious controversies which are happening at this time, so to do with monothelitism. He's the emperor who tries to arrest the Pope, and like his grandson, he succeeds. The other striking thing is that he manages to survive every usurper that rises up against him until he is assassinated in 668. A very chaotic reign, and although he's maybe not the best emperor, he certainly has a lot of qualities that endear him for being able to survive for 27 years in all of these circumstances and actually set the empire on the right footing to survive into the 8th century. So that's why I have chosen Constance II.
Yeah. It's certainly impressive that although he was a child ruler at the start of his reign, he managed to become a very competent emperor. I mean, there would be plenty of examples of emperors who got power on the youngish side of things who went off the rails a bit, like even Caligula, or in the case of being assassinated, Severus Alexander. And as you said, Constans II comes to power at the age of 10 after, in a way, a second year of the four emperors with Heraclius, Heraclius, or Constantine III, depending who you believe, Heraclius, and then him. So it's quite impressive that he manages to become a very competent ruler.
And he also seems to avoid all of the troubles of indolence that happen with some of them, like Michael III or Romanus II. He's not a flawless personal background. He does eventually execute his brother. It's possible he was planning something, but it's taken very badly.
Yes.
I wouldn't envy being in his shoes.
No, absolutely not. I mean, he's part of the transition from a superpower empire to a state battling to survive, so it's really not the period you'd want to be in.
No, definitely not. His legacies are quite long-lasting because his fleet is the groundwork for the later maritime themes of the empire, and also his reorganization of military supply and organization of the army is what eventually transforms into the theme system in subsequent centuries. So, how about your number 2?
Well, I suppose we should go back in time a little bit from the period when Egypt was being lost to one of the indirect causes of it being lost, because we are going to talk about Maurice, the last of the Justinianic dynasty. And Cassie, do you want to take us away on that?
I can try saying a few things. Maurice was a young man from Cappadocia, and he was designated successor a week before Tiberius II died. He was a ruler from 582 to 602. From what Vince has told me about him, he was very capable and powerful. Paid a lot of attention to the lands that Justinian had retaken, and he created the Exarchates of Ravenna in Carthage. The rest would have to be Vince because I don't really know all the specifics.
Yes, so the exarchates in this case being military and civilian governments headed by an exarch. And I suppose it's a bit like you were saying with Constans II, that Maurice pays more attention to the West in a way that previous emperors might not have done so much, or subsequent emperors wouldn't. And he even manages to get the Persian Empire, in a way, on side after helping Khosrow II become Shah. And although this will cause problems later on, it does mean the empire is stable on that frontier for quite a number of years. His downfall really is that the treasury was pretty much empty when he became emperor, and he wasn't always that popular with the soldiers. Case in point being at the end of his reign, when he had men campaigning on the other side of the Danube River, which is in itself a huge success. There are men not only pushing back up to the Danube River, but actually going beyond it. But when he tells them that they need to camp for the winter over the river, the soldiers mutiny and go back to Constantinople. Then at this point, either Maurice decided that both his son, Theodosius, and Germanus, Theodosius' father-in-law, were traitors because they were noted as being potential emperors, and both were punished. So Constantinople then breaks out into riots, with Maurice and the royal family running away to Nicomedia, but Phocas declares himself emperor, or is declared emperor, captures Maurice and his family, and executes all of his sons before executing Maurice himself. But the reason I would say that Maurice is up there in terms of the list is that he managed to keep the entire empire pretty much together in a way that it hadn't been for a while. With the exarchates of Ravenna and Carthage, he managed to keep the West stable again, and John Julius Norwich have said that he left the Roman Empire a lot more powerful than when he started his reign. So I don't know if you have any extra insight on Maurice here, but I would say he's quite an interesting character again to follow.
Definitely. I think he's the trouble with all three of the late 6th century emperors is that they all get overshadowed by the reign of Justinian in terms of focus and study. But all three of them are very interesting cases. And I think Maurice is a really good example of how the empire could have maintained itself after Justinian.
Yeah.
I think the ultimate irony of his reign, though, is that he is the author of his own destruction because of how parsimonious he was. Because the mutiny at the end of his reign is not the first one. It happened twice previous to that, I think, where he tried to do some cost-saving measure, which the army didn't like, and they end up mutinying. So he should have really seen it coming as well. Also, his plan of succession was probably never going to work because his original plan was to try and divide the empire between all of his sons. So have like a emperor of the West and emperor of the East and so on. In the 20 years he is emperor, he is very good. He finally defeats the Persians quite permanently. And for the 9 years, the first 11 years of his reign are spent fighting the Persians till 592, and then the rest of his reign is spent fighting the Avars and Slavs. So it is kind of a reign of two halves, but the peace with the Persians is lasting until his death. So had it gone longer, it may have well held for his lifetime. And again, he is starting to make changes. Part of these parsimonious policies is that he's trying to pay for the army without having to take the same measures that Justinian did, where Justinian would just stop paying the army for periods to pay for other wars that are going on. Whereas Maurice is trying to pay for the whole army all of the time, but trying to make it more cost effective. Some of the things he does succeed, and then some of the things he does fails, like making his army spend the winter in hostile territory. It's a shame his reign ended how it did, I say.
But...
Well, one thing I find impressive is that we have still a strategic manual that he wrote that still exists now.
Definitely, it's a major source for how the Roman army operated in this time. And it's what Leo VI mainly bases his Tactica on in the 9th century. So it's a very important book. In fact, fun fact is that we know it was written by Maurice because there's a note on the side of one of the manuscripts saying it was written by him. Because they have to be copied and copied again. There's a few books like that, which we only know about because someone decided to note it down in the margin somewhere. There's the history of Genesius, which we only know is by Genesius because, again, someone wrote down that this book was by him.
I think one of the tragedies of Maurice's reign, in a way, is that he becomes a victim of hindsight in that when he dies, the war with Persia, set off by the idea that his eldest son is still alive, is what weakens both empires, which perhaps doesn't put them in the best position when Islam emerges as a force. and therefore allows rapid conquests to start happening in both the Sasanian, Persian, and Roman empires. So a very competent ruler, but someone who, with hindsight, did in some way contribute to the collapse that would follow.
But also, his legacies do last after
Yeah.
his death as well. Like the Exarchate of Ravenna and Africa continue until both provinces fall, because
Right.
they lose Ravenna in the 8th century. That's still 2 centuries later than Africa right at the end of the 7th century. So they maintain the same provincial organization for that time. So his changes in the West carry on for long after he's dead. There's a brilliant book about him by Michael Whitby, translated the main source for his reign, Theophylax Simicata, and also wrote a book about Maurice himself, which probably the 2 main studies of his reign. In fact, it's quite funny when you read the introduction of it, you've got lots of historians wanting someone to write something about Maurice.
Yeah.
You have to wait until him to actually do it. Maurice is one of these emperors that definitely deserves more study and attention. Sticking with late antiquity, I decided to choose Theodosius II. And this is a strange one to many, probably, because his reputation until very recently has been one of a sort of do-nothing who's by Attila the Hun. That's been the case for quite a long time. I remember reading a quote by the scholar A.H.M. Jones, who says that Theodosius I was a very talented emperor, and this was not a trait inherited by his sons or grandsons, or something like that, which is not the best write-up.
No.
But I kept reading more and more about Theodosius II, and I kept seeing more and more of the things that we consider great deeds by other emperors, or just general achievements, which kind of get glossed over. There are lots of anecdotes about his reign, or about him, which don't paint him in the best of light. So, for instance, there's one about him being given a law to sign by his sister, Pulcheria, and he just signs it without reading it. And it's actually a law to make his sister a slave or something like that. And then she comes in and rebukes him for not being diligent enough. It's a fun story, and it doesn't really paint him in the best light, but
Not particularly.
that's all it is. It's a story. It doesn't really tell you anything about what he did. So I shall now go through some of the things he did do. He rebuilt the Hagia Sophia, which had burned down. He made another one, which will last until the reign of Justinian, which will also burn down. He also won 2 short wars with Persia. He centralized power and the institutions of government in Constantinople itself, which I think is a really important part of the development of the Eastern Roman Empire, and also kind of solidifying the empire's constitution, if you will. So let me explain this a little bit. During his reign, the emperor, the heads of the army, the church, which is increasingly more and more important, the court, and the administration are all centered in Constantinople. And so the previous way of moving around to the various different capitals of the empire during the 4th century stops. And the centralization of power had been started by Theodosius I and Arcadius, but it really comes to fruition in Theodosius II's reign. This is where the hippodrome is, this is where all the important news happens. People are consuls in Constantinople. There aren't any rebellions. In fact, something he actively does is seek out people who are suspected traitors or suspected of plotting a rebellion and dealing with them before a revolt ever happens, which is something which kind of slips through in most accounts, in that he is really on top of keeping potential rebels in check. which is a huge problem in the West, and increasingly so. We've got rebels popping up every 5 minutes. So you have this huge centralization of power. It also means that if you are a rebel, the only way to access this power is in Constantinople. And later on in the century, when you have several rebels like Leontius and Marcian who try and seize control from outside of Constantinople, they have a lot of trouble doing it because they have to try and rely on the local resources, but then they don't have access to the powers in Constantinople. I mean, like Leontius, who has the support of Antioch, he's got the support of the former Empress Verina, he's got the support of the general Illus, and he's got the support of a small army. He's defeated on his way to try and take Constantinople and then bottled up in Fort in Isauria for the next 4 years. So despite having this big power base, it comes to nothing because it evaporates immediately. Whereas the revolts that actually appear in Constantinople, like Basiliscus against Zeno, are far more successful because he is in Constantinople and can immediately take over the institutions of power. Revolts from this period onwards become more about being the control of Constantinople rather than various parts of the empire. He subjugates the Western Roman Empire, which I hadn't quite realised. After the defeat of the tyrant Ioannes in 425, every Western emperor has to be approved by the East. Like Valentinian III, he is related to Theodosius II, in that he is his cousin. He marries the daughter of Theodosius II. He is granted his title of emperor by Theodosius II. Theodosius II, in fact, after his victory, wants to go to Ravenna to crown Valentinian III himself, which I think is quite an important symbolic symbol. He's unable to because he falls ill, but suddenly the Western emperor becomes the junior partner of the East instead of the more equal partnership you had before between, say, Honorius and Arcadius. And if you look at later emperors like Majorian or Anthemius, they either come from the East or have to get approval from the East to be considered a legitimate emperor.
Yeah.
And in fact, in some 6th century sources, they start referring to these last shadow emperors from the West after Honorius as Caesar rather than Augustus, which I think rams home the point of this change in the power dynamic between the two. So there are some really pivotal changes to the internal power within the empire and also the relationship between West and East that emanate from Theodosius II's reign. And I think the credit has to come from the top, which is Theodosius II, because otherwise, where else would it come from?
Yeah, makes sense.
And then there's other things. So there's a lot of cultural output from this period. There's lots of churches being built. There's an interest in cartography, which is quite interesting. The first street lamps are introduced in Constantinople. It's actually the role of the Senate to make sure the street lamps are lit and so on. The empire is growing in prosperity economically. So there's a lot of land being brought into cultivation in this period. And of course, the Theodosian Code itself is very important, where it was the first surviving Roman legal code, but it's also the first one to have quite a lot of scope in that it goes back to Constantine. And then there's Attila the Hun, of course. On the surface of it, it looks like Theodosius II didn't do very well. Most of his armies are defeated. Most of the Balkans is just laid waste, and he has to pay tribute to make Attila go away twice. But if you think about it, he has quite literally tried everything, defeating him through force of arms. His next resort is to buy them off, which is actually normal Roman practice. So it's not necessarily Theodosius II, the weak emperor. It's Theodosius II using normal Roman diplomatic processes. That okay, we cannot defeat them in the field, let's try and negotiate with them. There's a lot that can be reassessed or re-examined about Theodosius II's reign, which I think is mainly to do with that a lot of older authorities have looked at it and gone, there's nothing interesting there, and then just moved on. Whereas newer scholars like Fergus Miller in the 2000s, and then there was a book by Christopher Kelly in 2013, which have looked at Theodosius II's reign. And there's a lot more going on there than had been we originally thought. So that's my next entry.
Oh, it's very interesting, the whole thing of centralizing power in Constantinople, and I think this is something the empire probably struggled with for a while, such as during the crisis of the 3rd century, where emperors could be declared anywhere in the empire, so I suppose it did put a handle on this problem a little bit. I find it interesting that he seems to have subjugated, quote unquote, the Western Roman Empire, because this isn't something I've really come across before, and I can't help wondering, is this a precursor to Odoacer sending the Western insignia to the east to signify there's only one Roman Empire from now on, Zeno's empire at the time, but is this preeminence of the Eastern Roman Empire under Theodosius and subsequently what might have triggered this esteem he held it in? And yeah, I think frankly, when it comes to Attila the Hun, survival is probably the best you can hope for, seeing as the Western Roman Empire seems to have been pulverized by Attila. And I seem to remember reading once, I don't remember where, that the Eastern Roman Empire was lucky in this regard as well, in that the Bosphorus meant that the rich provinces to the east were naturally protected from Attila a little bit more. And in the west, maybe in the case of Carthage, that might be true, but everything else was within easy reach of the Huns. But I think Theodosius, in that respect, might be overlooked a lot because he bowed to Attila, quote unquote. But really, once you've exhausted all other options, there's not much else you can do if you want to survive.
Yeah. I mean, Attila had defeated every army that was sent against him. This was over a decade of on and off warfare. The Romans came very close to defeating Attila, but they still weren't able to do it. It's only Aetius and his last alliance of Romans and Visigoths that they managed to beat them back.
Yeah.
You've got the Pope doing popey things. He did all the things that one could reasonably be expected to do in that situation.
Yeah.
And also, to come back what you're saying about the Western Roman Empire, Odoacer and Julius Nepos send messages to Zeno after the deposition of Romulus Augustus in 476. So you still have that authority emanating from Constantinople that Nepos wants the Eastern Roman Empire to help him get back Italy, and then Odoacer is sending the ensigns of the empire, is constantly trying to make himself legitimate during his reign. Why would they be needing to do that if they didn't need Eastern approval?
Yeah.
The answer is they do need Eastern approval because that is where the source of legitimacy is coming from, whether they like it or not. The answer Zeno gives, which we do have, or the second-hand report of it, is very interesting in that he actually tries to help Nepos. He can't do anything because when this is happening, he's just retaken the throne from Basiliscus. So Zeno's not really in a position to help the West in this period. And for the next few years, he's either fighting usurpers like Marcian and Leontius or fighting the Ostrogoths. So Zeno is busy, but he still tries to help Nepos out. He's trying to get Odoacer to, I think it's recognize Nepos as his emperor or something like that. So there's a diplomatic favor for Nepos, which lasts until Nepos dies in 480. And then Zeno isn't interested in any more Western rulers. There's supposedly the Gauls later ask if they can get recognition of some sort, and Zeno just tells them to go away. It's a very interesting period, and again, it all kind of comes back to Theodosius II. And
No, it definitely shows that the East is more preeminent after he's done with the Empire than when he takes power.
And also the walls. We shouldn't forget the walls.
No, very true.
So, on to your next emperor.
Well, we thought we would break from the sort of chronological timeline a little bit. So, going from Theodosius just barely leaving the Empire stable when Attila's around to Alexios I, jumping forward a few centuries. So, Alexios is emperor from 1081 to 1118 and inherits the empire at, I think it's fair to say, a truly terrible time to be ruler. The Seljuks have just swept through Anatolia and pretty much carved up half the empire's provinces for themselves. And there has been a revolving door of emperors from multiple dynasties, or in some cases even non dynastic. And when he takes power, he's therefore faced with, I think it's fair to say, enemies on all fronts. The Normans over in southern Italy are preparing to send an expedition into Byzantium because they believe they have someone who is actually Michael VII Ducas, or perhaps they're using this as an excuse. And it's actually a monk called, I believe, Reichtor or Rakitor, I'm not sure. And over the course of his reign, Alexios manages to defeat the Normans, first off, and then ask Pope Urban II's help to take back the Anatolian provinces. He, granted, receives a little more help than he expected when a crusade arrives to take back Jerusalem, but he manages to successfully navigate past this and recapture land in Anatolia, and generally start a revival which his son and grandson will continue, called the Komnenian Restoration. So I would say, with the empire that he was handed in 1081, he did an astonishing amount of work to turn everything around. And that's why he's on our list.
Definitely. I like to think of him as the second Diocletian. They're very similar in some ways in that they are handed quite a ropey situation.
Yeah.
And their solution is the total transformation of how things work in the Roman Empire. For the first 10 years of Alexius's reign, from 11 years, 1081 to 92, it is really, really bad.
Yeah.
Things get significantly worse before they get better. I mean, he's just barely able to hold the Normans in check in Greece.
Yeah.
Which he lost the first 3 battles against them quite handily each time. I mean, he's nearly captured in the first one at Dyrrhachium, which, I mean, would normally be enough to end any emperor's reign sometimes, losing that consistently. And the economy gets worse. By 1092, he's having to mint lead coins. You're quite right in that the empire is being attacked from every side. It's almost like a round robin of invaders. You've got the Normans in the west, you've got the Pechenegs and Cumans in the north, and then have the Turks in the east who are starting to take the coastline. And he manages to sort all of these things out, which is just quite amazing, really.
It's very impressive.
Was the most interesting thing about Alexios's reign?
Well, I would say it's very interesting, less so about his reign, but more in general, that we have his own daughter Anna's account of his reign, which is, as far as I'm aware, unique among our primary sources. And I would say the way he handled the crusade probably deserves a lot of praise, because it wasn't the help he was expecting at all, and could probably have been a very dangerous situation, but he managed to use it, albeit without getting everything he wanted, to restore Roman fortunes. Had he been able to get Antioch back for the empire, the empire's rise might have been a lot smoother and gone quite a bit further, but it's very impressive how he managed to handle the cards he was given.
It's the beginnings of Eastern Roman Empire really having to take the West seriously.
Yeah.
As proper, was before this point, apart from the Holy Roman Empire, the West isn't really too much of a factor for the Romans in the same. But after this point, suddenly have to know Western court etiquette and how things work in the West. It's like when the Crusaders arrive, Alexios gets all of them to swear an oath to return land that they conquer to the empire, which shows that Alexios has done his homework, because the taking of oaths and liege and vassal obligations is a huge factor in the West. What do you think could be a criticism of his reign?
Arguably, I would say, from a modern standpoint, the persecution of heresy would be considered a negative. But then again, unity was potentially more important than these dissenting viewpoints, because Alexios might have been thinking that from such heretical sects, quote unquote, a pretender could easily have emerged. But from a humanitarian standpoint, I would say the way his troops sacked Constantinople, or at the very least looted it upon his coming to power in 1081, was, by modern standards, unfortunate, but even at the time would have required quite a bit of effort to push to one side. I seem to remember Alexios needs to do penance such as sleeping with a rock instead of a pillow. So arguably that's one of the drawbacks of his reign, the method by which he came to power.
Something I've studied is the reign of his predecessor, Nicephorus III. And if you read a lot of sources from after his reign, there's an increasing attempt to try and make Alexios look like the good guy, to try and justify what he does. So, and I agree with the persecution thing. It's one of the things that it's got so bad that he has to resort to very strict measures. One of the first things he does, I think he's a former student of Michael Psellus, but a guy called John Italos.
Yeah.
He's put on a heresy trial, basically, in, I think it's the winter of 1081 to 2. It's very early on that this all happens. I think also it comes back to this idea that, things have gone very, very badly. You now need to get the powers that be back on your side. And then later on in his reign, you have a similar approach to the Bocomils.
I suppose that's true, but it's arguably a product of the time he was in, how difficult the first 10 years were.
Is there anything you want to add for Alexios
I? I think the final takeaway that we would have for him would be that the winner really does write history, and it's very impressive how far he managed to come with what he was given. So I think that leads us on to your next emperor. So who have you got for us?
Decided to talk about Manuel I. He is kind of the end product of the successors of Alexios and his son John. He reigns for the same amount of time as Alexios, 37 years. He's the first and probably only figure from the period from Alexios I onwards who comes close to being Justinianic in a way. He brings the empire back onto the world stage as a medieval superpower. He is involved in arranging marriages between his dynasty and France, with his arranging marriage between his son Alexios and Agnes of France, and then he's involved in events with the Kievan Rus, and he campaigns against the Turks, and he brings the Crusader states into vassalization, if you like, as he becomes the overlord of those areas. And also in Hungary, he's trying to expand the empire in many directions. So he's the only emperor after Constance II to try and reconquer Egypt along with the Crusaders. And then he tries to reconquer southern Italy. He's involved with politics in Italy. He defeats the Venetians, which is something his father failed to do. On and off for 15 years of war with Hungary and the Serbs, manages to defeat both of them and make conquests there, and brings both of their kings into subjugation. I mean, it only lasts for his lifetime, but once he's able to defeat them, then those frontiers go quiet, and they take up a significant portion of his time. The interesting thing is that while he's fighting the Hungarians and the Serbs, he can also He also has enough resources to campaign in southern Italy at the same time. So it's kind of the flowering of all of the things that the Komnenians are trying to rebuild after the 11th century. And it almost comes to the height of the good old days again, if you like, with Manuel I, in that he's able to do all of these things. And I think it's just a shame for him that not more of his ventures resulted in lasting successes. I was thinking recently, what if, I mean, it's a counterfactual, but what if every conquest he did embark upon had been a success? You would have had southern Italy, coastal Egypt, and central Anatolia brought into the empire just during his reign. I mean, it's pointless whether or not it would have lasted or not, but just in that fact alone, no one had done this centuries in terms of the scale of what he's trying to do. I mean, you have to go back to the 10th century emperors, really, to look at similar scale expansionism. That's just that. I mean, like we said earlier about Justinian, he's one of these multifaceted emperors who's got his hand in multiple pies.
Yeah.
One of the things which his greatest detractor, Nikitas Konyatos, says in his praises is that he is the emperor who really invests in the imperial possessions in Asia Minor again. So, although John and Alexios have reconquered areas, it's still very much a frontier, whereas Manuel takes significant steps to integrate these provinces more into the empire. He establishes new themes. They're not the same as the old themes, but that's what they're called. But he builds new fortresses and castra in places like Pergamon and Adramyttium. So he's fortifying these places, and also he's moving peasants into Asia Minor to bring land back into cultivation and also supply the forts. So these places are now self-sustaining. When the Turks do attack these areas, they can just retreat into these fortresses and then nothing happens. When the Turks go, they just come out again and carry on. He's also able to advance the frontier into Asia Minor. He rebuilds the city of Dorylaeum and Sibilia, Phrygia, and is really trying to push the boundaries. He did actually spend quite a bit of time in Anatolia. It's like the beginning of his reign is a bit difficult because he's got the Second Crusade happening. He's just become emperor with his father dying on campaign. So it's a difficult situation anyway. And he has to race back to Constantinople to secure his throne. But he spends the last years of his reign campaigning in Anatolia. The Myrocephalon campaign in the 1170s is very much directed towards trying to conquer central Anatolia. Again, it's a shame that campaign ended in failure. From Nikitas Konyatos' takeaway about why investing in Asia Minor is so important is that he sets up the survival of the empire with 1204, after the Fourth Crusade, in that Asia Minor becomes this small, compact stronghold in which the Romans are able to rebuild afterwards. One could argue that had Manuel not done this investment in the area, then the Romans may not have been able to do that. And then there's other things like, so some of his laws are quite interesting. So he forbid the poor from selling themselves into slavery. So he banned that. He opened law courts on festival days. So before, if there was a feast day, law courts had to remain closed. So more people can access the judicial system. There's a interesting building which he creates, which is this giant chain across the Bosphorus, a bit like the one over the Golden Horn in Constantinople, but significantly larger. I suspect it didn't last very long, but and then there's stuff to do with monasteries, which he gets involved with. He builds a new reservoir and rebuilds and clears aqueducts in Constantinople. He carries on his father's policy of inviting Latins into the empire to get involved in the government and do things. This is something which the Romans have to come to terms with. They have to come to terms with the fact that the Latins, the Westerners, are moving east. Their interests are becoming wider than their neighbours.
Yeah.
The West is really starting to, this is partly because of the Crusades. Suddenly you have to think about Jerusalem. So the Eastern Roman Empire is naturally going to start factoring into that. So yeah, that's why I think Manuel is a great emperor. I think one could go more into it, and I know scholars have, like Paul Magdaleno, his gigantic tome about Manuel I. But
Yeah.
I all too often see people kind of bemoan what he didn't do or failed to do, rather than actually look at what he did do. A bit like Justinian. So
it's definitely interesting that, seeing as Manuel wasn't even meant to govern, being the fourth son of John II, it's remarkable how lucky the Eastern Roman Empire got, in a sense.
it was a difficult time because I spoke about his wars with Hungary, but the Normans invade Greece again. The wars with Hungary are all defensive wars in that Hungarians and Serbs are trying to expand into the Balkans. So this is a problem Manuel has to face. And not only is he able to beat them, but also subjugates and annexes most of Serbia, and also annexes parts of Hungary as well, pushes them back over the Danube. So it's a complete humiliation for these two powers, which are looking to expand into his realm.
Yeah, very interesting time.
So how about your next chappie?
Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about Basil II, who ruled from 976 to 1025. He's known for extending his imperial rule in the Balkans, like Bulgaria or even Mesopotamia, Georgia, and Armenia. He increased his domestic authority by attacking powerful landed interests of the military aristocracy and of the church. He was the eldest son of Romanos II. He was very intelligent, energetic, but not very cerebral. He did not marry and live frugally. He had a determination to govern, but he found problems. His granduncle Basil I Komnenos was one, as he had held onto control for 3 decades. Generals were also beginning to think they would be better as rulers than someone of hereditary unproven right. 2 generals in particular would cause problems for 13 years. The first one was Bardas Skleros, who rebelled in the 970s. He was defeated in 979, and Basil II used the gap until 985 to strengthen himself. He also dispatched his uncle to a jail. But then he had to deal with Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria. He was nearly annihilated by Samuel at Trajan's Gate. In August 986, he took an oath when he was back in Constantinople to avenge himself on Bulgaria.
But then there's more problems from Skleros again, because he's hiding in Baghdad with the Caliph, and after the battle at Trajan's Gate, he sees his chance.
He comes back and declares himself emperor. Phocas also rebelled in 987. They agreed to split Rome between themselves along the sea, but Skleros was caught by Phocas, who marched on the capital. Basil reached out to Kievan Rus, who gave him 6,000 Varangians in exchange for Basil's sister Anna as a bride for Vladimir. Basil then defeated and killed Phocas in 989. Skleros was released by his captor, the wife of Phocas, once he died. But he did accept Basil's conditions as he was aging. He recommended to Basil that he keep the nobility under his thumb. Basil then didn't do too much until 995, when is the time he had to go to Syria on another mission.
So this expedition to Syria was because the emir of Aleppo and Antioch were under threat from the Fatimids, so Basil rushes over to the east, arriving with 17,000 soldiers, which he's brought there on horseback, so flying over east at breakneck speed, manages to save Aleppo from the siege and causes the Fatimid Caliph to run away. But one of his main problems remains that the nobility are very powerful, as he sees firsthand on the way back from Anatolia. So he issued an edict in 996 to say any land claim needed to go back 61 years to count, so basically kneecapping the nobility and giving land back to the peasants. There is a little bit, again, of a counterfactual which could have presented itself, because he sent his niece, the future Empress Zoe, to marry Holy Roman Emperor Otto III. And John Julius Norwich, in his account, says that any child from this union might have inherited both empires, which would definitely be ripe ground for counterfactuals, but unfortunately or fortunately, it didn't happen. But Basil's main legacy in common imagination, I think, is with the Bulgars. So he fought with them until 1018, and at that point he entered the capital of the Bulgarian Empire in triumph, essentially destroying it completely. But something which I'd say he's most famous for in this regard is that in 1014 he blinded 15,000 men of the Bulgarian army, leaving only 1 out of 100 one eye so they could go back to their Tsar. Now, this story may be apocryphal, as said by Witto in his book on the period between 600 and 1025, but Tsar Samuel is supposed to have died upon apoplexy on seeing this. Basil conquered Bulgaria, but wasn't a hostile ruler, so their church was allowed to remain somewhat autonomous, and taxes were made in kind rather than with money, and this was good for Bulgaria because a money economy didn't really exist. And even over in the east, we've got success, creating 8 new provinces in 1023. And when he died in 1025, he was preparing to recapture Sicily, just as Manuel would have done. And in point of fact, an expedition did go west after he died under someone called Orestes, but was defeated. We would say that Basil is a very successful figure who managed to, through sheer dogged determination, get the Balkan area back under control. And people such as Norwich have noted that his main failing is in not having children, because the collapse of the Macedonian dynasty, which followed in the decades afterwards, preceded the crisis which Alexios would have to mop up again in the late 11th century. So that's why he's on our list.
What did you find was the most interesting thing you found when reading about Basil II?
I would say it's interesting that you can to some extent see the psychology of Basil's reign. So early on, there are the rebel generals telling him that the nobility need to be kept under pressure, and he seems to take this very much to heart. So the emperor becomes once again the dominant figure, with the nobility being kept firmly under the emperor's boot. And it's very impressive, although arguably from a modern standpoint somewhat worrying psychologically, how much pressure he managed to keep on Bulgaria year after year with such determination. And you could argue this is what the empire needed at this point, a focused effort to deal with Bulgaria, which had been encroaching for quite some time. But it's interesting that he managed to bring about a golden age, if you like, of expansion both in the east and in the west.
Something which is interesting about Basil's reign, from a historian's perspective, there aren't actually that many sources for his reign.
Right.
The main source is a guy called John Skylitzky. So how do you think that what we know of Basil II is affected by having such a limited pool of sources to use?
The lack of multiple sources probably means that there are different perspectives that are missing. So if we go back to the example of Justinian, even among the same author, Procopius, we have a highly positive account in his history of the wars, and then a highly negative one in his secret histories. So probably we're missing some of the nuance around Basil as a person with the lack of sources. And with only one source, it's probably too subjective. You know, you've got one person's viewpoint, and you've got to pretty much take their word for it. Whereas sometimes in other eras of history, you've got multiple sources balancing each other out in terms of their inaccuracies.
What do you think of him being the longest reigning Roman emperor? Do you think it's surprising that he is?
To some extent, I would say yes, given how young he was when his father Romanos died. And I suppose it's testament in the first instance to the loyalty which people felt to the Macedonian dynasty, because if not, someone like Nicephorus II or John I could easily have swept him and his brother off the stage. And second of all, it's a testament to the fact that I imagine Basil's work was one of relentlessly pushing to make sure you stay in the same place with regard to, for example, the nobility. He could potentially very easily have been swept away, but you get the impression of someone who was ceaselessly vigilant, and I would say that probably contributed to his longevity. Now, what would you say is the most interesting aspect of Basil's reign?
It's an interesting one in that bit like a reign of two halves, because
Yeah,
I think it really changes after Trajan's Gate in some ways. So Trajan's Gate's 986, I think.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think it might be August 986.
So the early part of his reign is dominated first by you've got the coup of Nicephorus II, and then you've got the coup of John I, and then you've got
Yeah.
the rebellion of Bardus Skleros, and then you've got Basil having to get rid of his uncle, another Basil I Komnenos. So the first 20 years of his reign is spent in the sidelines, really, and just trying to fight to even be emperor. And then the first thing he does is have a complete pig's breakfast of a campaign against the Bulgars, which is and then that causes another civil war. So you kind of have almost a whole emperor's reign fighting civil wars and internal political struggles and so forth. So that by the time he's able to actually have a consistent strategy against the Bulgars and fighting the Fatimids and so forth, he is quite an experienced and grizzled veteran. And then a lot of what he achieves happens next 25 years of his reign. Conquest of Bulgaria, conquest of various places in the east. His legacy is established quite quickly, and it's one which is remembered long afterwards as well, because Isaac, who's the emperor in the 1050s, he kind of presents himself as Basil II Mark II. It doesn't last for very long, but that's what he's trying to do. And then you've got the historian John Zonaras calling him the Bulgar Slayer. When Isaac Angelus is campaigning against the Bulgarians in the 12th century, you've got people around him being like, you should study the campaigns of Basil II. You know, he makes it into the popular imagination of the Romans, which is quite interesting, quite an interesting legacy.
Yeah.
Do you have anything more you wish to say about it?
I think that's pretty much covered it. A story of being remarkably unremarkable for the most part, but hanging in there.
Basil's the greatest conqueror of the 10th and 11th centuries. But my next pick is the originator of that, which is Romanus I. And I want to talk about why he's the originator of that. Mainly because it's during his reign that the whole approach to warfare in the East changes. He comes to power in 920 after a coup, and you've had several failures in the decade before that. So you've got the Bulgarians pushing in from the north. He manages to essentially stalemate the Bulgarians in the Balkans. Unfortunately, Simeon the Great dies. He establishes peace for the next 40 years with Bulgaria, which gives them a bit of breathing room. But talking about the East, he assigns a guy called John Korkuas as the domestic of the Skolai, so the commander-in-chief, really, as the Eastern commander for 20 years, which is incredibly unusual. But it also means that John Korkuas can sort of set policy of how he wants to conduct the campaign in the East. And he's responsible for the first major conquest of one of the Arab emirates in the area, Melitene, which, although in the grand scheme of things is not a huge area, it's the start of this rolling back of the frontier against the Arabs rather than just kind of stalemating them, which they've done before, and then taking little parcels of land where they can. which has been the experience for the last 2 centuries in the 8th and 9th. So it's suddenly in the 10th that the Romans are trying to really push into the east. And then this is picked up by his successors, Constantine VII, Romanus II, Nicephorus, John, and Basil. But it starts really with Romanus I and John Corcoras. And also, this is reflected in the military manuals of the time, where you have Leo's Tactica, which is a big compilation of old military manuals like Maurice's, but also even more ancient ones. And then you start having new military manuals written, like the Silliologe Tacticorum, which is written roughly in Romanus's reign, which is a much smaller version of Leo's book, but also has several new things, and also talks about how to use heavy cavalry and so forth. So the actual tactics involved are starting to change, and this continues throughout the 10th century with each new manual. Shows you how it progresses throughout that era.
Yeah.
So very quickly, the East goes from quite a passive front to an increasingly aggressive one. And then, more generally, peace is restored. I mean, Romanus I is emperor for the next 24 years. He's only deposed because, by that point, so old he's looking to retire anyway. And he wants to make the emperor he elbowed aside his successor instead of his natural sons, which they're not too happy about.
Yeah.
So they exile him instead. A big internal matter he has to deal with is the Great Famine, and as you've mentioned before, is the event which causes all of these land laws which appear in the 10th century.
Yeah.
What happens is you have this very cold winter, and the ground remains snowbound and frozen for 100 days, which means that by the time it melts, there's no time to seed any crops, and so suddenly there's a huge famine. And so Romanus does his best to try and cope with this crisis, and he sets up poorhouses and almshouses to try and treat the poor, and he sets up bread distribution points and so forth. And then his land law is connected with that, in that a lot of people have had to sell their land to try and get the money to pay for essentials of life. And so suddenly lots of churches and landowners, but especially churches and monasteries, buy up all of this land. His land law is about scaling this back and making sure you don't suddenly completely undermine the peasantry because of this major crisis. This is something which gets repeated by his successors. So Constantine VII, Nicephorus II, and as we said, Basil II also issue these land laws. And then just general success. So a Viking attack on Constantinople, which is defeated, which is quite a moment, because you have this huge Viking fleet sent by the Kievan Rus, and then you've got 15 old warships which are suddenly put into fighting shape, set out into the sea, and then with Greek fire they burn all of the Russian ships and force them to flee. He's sending military expeditions westward to try and fight the Moorish pirates, which are attacking southern France and the coasts of Italy and Sicily and so forth. Although the achievements of his reign are not necessarily the most spectacular and groundbreaking, he sets up how the kind of things the 10th century emperors, their approach to rule is. So campaigning in the east and west, issuing land laws, being usurped by people who just kind of muscle into the imperial family rather than try and get rid of it, and the changing relations between Bulgaria and the Romans. Yeah, he was a very interesting person and an important emperor.
I would speculate as well that in Romanos and the Macedonian dynasty more generally, you can see something that was also seen much earlier in Roman history during the period of the Nerva Antonines, this tension between hereditary right versus competency in terms of ruling. So with the example of the Nerva Antonines, you have competent individuals adopting each other generation after generation, but that's changed a bit by Romanos's day. So here we have individuals making themselves, for example, in Romanos's case, father-in-law of the emperor and running almost a parallel imperial family. So it's a different solution to the same problem, you could say.
That's probably one of us achievement I should have mentioned, is that despite only having one emperor, his family are relevant throughout the 10th century till Basil I Komnenos, his bastard son, is forced to retire by Basil II.
Yeah.
From 920 to 985, the Lacapanoi are in various parts of government. You also have a patriarch, Theophylact, who's a Lacapanos. And then the rest of the Macedonians all related to Romanus through his daughter, who's also quite instrumental in helping Constantine VII become emperor. She joins her husband against her brothers in getting rid of them after he's deposed. Romanus, that is.
Yeah, it's a very interesting period.
So, on to your next one.
So our fifth and final candidate for today is going back a few centuries again to finish us off. It's Heraclius, who ruled from 610 to 641. So Heraclius comes to power after the tyranny of Emperor Phocas once Maurice is deposed. And during Phocas's tenure, the Sasanian Persians have declared war on the empire because they believe Theodosius, Maurice's son, to still be alive. And so the Persians managed to go, I think it's fair to say, a lot further than any previous emperor had intended the Persians would ever go. And Heraclius comes to power amidst this chaotic war across several years of hard fighting. He manages to get the empire back to status quo antebellum. Initially, he has an army which doesn't really have a high quality of recruits, so he gets them to train by fighting each other. And I think that in Heraclius's reign, the primary source we get, Theophanes, really makes it seem very fantastical and like Greek myth. I don't remember the name, but I think, for example, that we actually have the name of Heraclius's horse just randomly thrown in at some point. But Heraclius spends years fighting the Persians and actually manages to chase or catch the Sasanian Shah unawares at one point and have him flee one of the royal residences. So by the end of the war, at the end of the 620s, he's managed to restore everything back to the way it was. And just when you think that he can breathe a sigh of relief, Islam shows up and undoes pretty much everything in the long term that he'd managed to achieve, so that by the end of his reign, Egypt is on the point of falling away again. The Romans have been defeated at Yarmouk in 636, and Heraclius has been assessed by some as just sort of giving up at this point. So overall, I would say Heraclius' reign is a very mixed bag, where had he died a few years or even a decade earlier, he might be remembered a lot more positively than he is in terms of his impact on the empire.
I think that's all very good points. So Heraclius has to focus almost entirely on the Persians. Do you think he was right to focus entirely on the Persians?
In the long term, knowing what we know with hindsight, that Islam is going to show up, it might have been better if the war had been brought to an earlier conclusion so that both empires could focus on the coming threat. But then again, the rise of Islam was something that nobody would have expected at the time, and Heraclius could only work with the information he had. So, in the long term, it didn't achieve that much, his focusing on the Persians. But from the perspective of who's just come to power, it is imperative that the empire not crumble away at the onslaught.
And what do you think of Heraclius's strategy against the Persians versus his strategy against the Arabs?
From what I can tell from my reading, his strategy against the Arabs appears to be far more, after a certain point, retreating and fortifying areas they can hold, or bunkering down, if you will. But the Roman army's position, from what I understand, was that there was only really one army left by the time of the 630s, and the Battle of Yarmouk saw this force annihilated. So there wasn't really as much he could do, but equally he was advancing in years and starting to lose heart. So perhaps the empire would have been better served with a younger emperor with a more can-do attitude in a way. Is that how you would experience his two wars against the Persians and against Islam or the Arabs?
I think so. Persia is definitely where his faculties as a ruler come to play, who has to get the church to give their valuables over to the state so he can even mint enough money to pay his troops, and he actually has to lower salaries and so on, which probably says something about the times in that when he did do this, unlike Maurice, they didn't mutiny. So
Yeah.
the end is quite literally nigh. It's probably got quite a good morale boost for people. Ability to defeat the Persians in detail. I think also his trust, because the Persians have an alliance with the Avars, and the Avars attack Constantinople while he's away campaigning against them. Ability to trust his close advisors and his ministers to actually hold Constantinople is, I think, very good. And you do see it with other emperors who just can't trust anyone. And they're always interfering things and they fall afoul of their own paranoia.
Yeah. It's also interesting that Heraclius is really the point where the empire shifts from Latin into Greek. And I think historian Nick Holmes has mentioned on his podcast, The Fall of the Roman Empire, that he sees Heraclius and the loss of territory to Islam as where the change from classical Rome to the Byzantine state, if you will, happens. So, like Justinian, Heraclius is sort of seen as era defining.
Quite a physical way with just the loss of the most of the east and the south.
Yeah.
What allowed him to be so successful?
Yeah, partly I would speculate a bit like Alexios. It is the idea that the end times are at hand at the start of his reign and Alexios's reign. The idea that we need to band together to face an external existential threat. Like you said, that does tend to focus the mind quite brilliantly. So I'd say in his early reign, that was a big factor. And from what I remember of Theophanes' account of Heraclius's rule, he was quite a good general, choosing the most opportune path to travel into Persian territory. I think being quite cautious as well and knowing what the stakes were. And I think his marriage to Martina, his own niece, might have been a bit of a handicap politically in terms of how scandalous people thought it was. But even then, he managed to continue on despite this. So I would say just a very cautious ruler who knew the political mood, or at least knew the political landscape.
Although I do think it all starts to unravel near the end of his life. I think, as you said, he's kind of a bit past it. But can you blame him for spending over 30 years in such a role?
No, I guess not.
Time? What do you think of his plan for the succession?
I think had he died in 629, he would have been remembered a lot more favourably, especially seeing as his successor would then be forced to be the one who dealt with the rise of Islam. But in terms of his succession, the rule of both his eldest son and Heraclius with his mother Martina feels like it was bound to lead to problems. Martina was not the mother of both men. There was going to be some sort of factionalism, but even so, the Heraclian dynasty managed to go past this and keep on going until the late 600s. So, all in all, perhaps not the best thought out succession plan, but it worked ultimately in some fashion.
With a bit of palace coups here and there.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be the Roman Empire without them.
Absolutely not. We needed another year of the four emperors. The last one was 600 years ago.
I was reading the near eyewitness account by John of Niku, and Heraclius is trying to get involved with things, and all he's doing is causing more problems rather than solving them. So the one thing he does do is rebukes the Egyptian commanders for the conduct of the war so far in Egypt, which then alienates the local commanders from the ones sent from Constantinople against each other, which just causes friction between them and ultimately leads to the local commanders working independently from the supreme commander. So by that point he's just causing more problems for the empire when they really don't need any more. And that can also be said with monothelitism and stuff like that, where there's a good intention there where he's trying to solve problems, and they never satisfy everyone. And so the emperors are then lumbered with monothelitism for the next 50 years.
Yeah.
Which only about a third of the empire signs on with. So yeah, it's a reign of ups and downs.
Yeah.
Do you have any more comments on Heraclius?
I think that's about all there is to be said, broadly speaking. Just a sense of feeling sorry for him, perhaps. So I think that brings us to the last emperor we're discussing today. So we're going from the rise of Islam to stopping a potentially fatal siege by Islamic forces. So do you want to take us through it?
Yes, Leo III, who, a bit like Heraclius, is one of these come the hour, cometh the man people. He becomes emperor right when the Islamic Caliphate is in full invasion mode, and they've got troops outside the gates of the city, and he manages to depose the Emperor Theodosius III and becomes emperor himself. And in the year-long siege, he, together with the Bulgars, is able to just annihilate the Arab force by deceiving their commander, who for quite a long time thinks that Leo is going to open the gates, and he's waiting for Leo to give him Constantinople, which is something he's promised him before he became emperor. And the successful use of Greek fire and the Roman navy to prevent the Arab army being resupplied from the Caliphate, and also the troops in Anatolia managing to cut off all of the supply routes and reinforcements getting through. And then the Arabs trap themselves almost, because the Bulgars are on the outside and you've got Constantinople on the other side, so they're between a rock and a hard place. So whenever they try and go and forage, they're attacked by the Bulgars. There's not actually a mention of them trying to actually assault the city, so probably says something about the conditions for the Arabs during the siege, which get really bad. I mean, during the winter, which is especially harsh, there's reports of them having to eat dead bodies and eating the tar used for making ships and stuff like that. Awful stuff. So then you have this existential crisis, which is the rest of the over 30 years he's emperor are very successful. The trouble with Leo III is because he is the first of the Isaurian emperors who are known for their iconoclasm. He introduces iconoclasm into the empire. His achievements are played down or written out of history by the iconophiles later on. It's like the main source for his reign from the Byzantines are people writing many decades later, Nicephorus and Theophanes. What he does do is that he starts creating new armies as part of this development of the theme system. So the provincial administration is reformed and military supply is reformed as well. And this is something which takes place across the empire. He also reforms the organization of the navy. So now the navy which Constance II set up is sort of divided into different commands starting in the east. He introduces a new silver coin, which is the first silver coin to be introduced since Heraclius. Something to understand about the Roman economy in this period is that the Romans mainly used copper and gold coins,
Right.
with several denominations. And they did have silver coins, but they weren't really used for general use. This would be things that you would give out as a donative or like special occasions and stuff like that. This is the first silver coin for general use, and the way it's minted very much mirrors the way a Arab coin, silver coin, is minted. So, he was born in the East, so it shows he's taking lessons from the Arabs, but also it indicates that there's trade going on between the eastern frontiers, because it's not really a hard border at this point either.
Right.
It's very porous, so he's really retrenching the empire and trying to bring things back from the brink. And I think this is reflected very well in his law code called the Ecclesia, which is a user's guide almost to Roman law. It's got a lot of common Roman laws from Justinian code, which have all been translated into Greek. It also has first criminal laws as well in the empire. So if you do this, you will be punished in this way, to do theft or other things. A lot of it's inspired from Old Testament biblical law as well. There's quite a lot of legal outputs that happen in the 8th century. They really start with Leo. He has a big victory against the Arabs right at the end of his reign, but for most of his reign, the Arabs are invading Anatolia and it turns into a massive war zone. Lots of cities are sacked and villages devastated. It's kind of from this context of warfare, continuous warfare, that iconoclasm really appears, and that you had these icons start to be seen as the reason for all of these misfortunes. So you have the rise of iconoclasm, both from the bottom up and also when Leo adopts it in his court officially, a top-down iconoclasm and the beginnings of iconoclast persecution. He crushes a major revolt, 727, and he has a smooth succession. He sets up the dynasty which will last for the rest of the century. He also brings this period of anarchy to an end. I mean, he's the 7th emperor in a run of emperors in 20 years. One of the most frequent turnovers of emperors there is in the Eastern Roman Empire. He really manages to stabilize the empire. That's why I've put Leo III, quite rightly, in his place amongst our 10 very notable and important emperors.
Yeah, a well-deserved place.
Do you have any extra comments on Leo?
I suppose the only thought I've got to add would be that, like Heraclius, Leo seems to have given himself unnecessary theological divisions in the form of iconoclasm, which probably marred an otherwise positive reign in the eyes of the population.
I agree with that, in that the iconoclast controversy will be a big factor for the next 130-ish years, until the mid-9th century when it's finally stamped out. And that's all I have to say about Leo.
Yeah, a worthy addition to the 10.
Come to our closing remarks. I think you've chosen some very interesting emperors. I think Maurice is someone who definitely deserves a lot more love than he gets, or attention at all. I think there's a lot of nuance to be had with many of these figures. I mean, as someone coming at the Byzantine Empire a bit fresher than myself, how have you found learning about all of these figures?
It's definitely been very interesting to compare who people think the greats are, and in most lists, I think people like Basil II and Alexios make the cut, and definitely Justinian I, but it's been fascinating learning more about some of the emperors who are perhaps more overlooked.
I did specifically choose the emperors I did because I think their achievements are either a bit unknown or do require a bit of digging to get at.
Yeah.
To really appreciate them. I'm glad that I was able to get that across. It's interesting hearing about your choices and what you think of them all. Were there any surprises?
I would say that Theodosius II was the most surprising choice on that list, even if it is justifiable with moral explanation. He doesn't tend to spring out at you.
I think that's very true.
Yeah.
I found it very interesting trying to look at it completely fresh and making up my own mind without relying too much on the witty but somewhat glib comments from older historians about what I should think about these people.
Oh, likewise.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, and we will have our second part talking about some of our most infamous emperors and the people who are important but for the wrong reasons, which will be going up on your channel after this one. Thank you both for coming on and guesting on my channel.
Thank you for having us.
When our second video is up, we will put links in our description below. And this has been Eastern Roman History.